take the long, hard journey of truth leading to reconciliation with our Indigenous communities related to the historical traumas caused because of colonization. We will begin this evening with the traditional practice of recognizing and expressing gratitude for our shared spaces through a land acknowledgement. As this meeting is virtual and we are not all gathered in the same space, we recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, that you take responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. As a member of York University community, we recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. And York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. That dish has 3 simple teachings. First, never take more than your share. Second, make sure there's enough food to go around for everybody. And third, don't foul the dish or take the dish. We say these words to acknowledge the territory we gather on and the history of the land and people who have come before us. Whether this is the first time you've heard it or if you're familiar with it, we encourage you to learn more about the history of Indigenous people in Canada. We also extend to everyone an invitation to reflect on the land acknowledgement's message of sharing, caring, and joint responsibility, which are more important than ever as we continue our efforts towards cross-cultural learning and international understanding. We are grateful for the support that the Grounded Project and the creation of this film has received. And before we begin, we'd like to take this opportunity to share with you greetings from Dr. Alice Hovorka, the Dean for the Faculty of Environment and Urban Change at York University, who has both championed and supported the project since the beginning. Welcome, Alice. Can you unmute? Yeah.
Am I unmuted now? Thank you, Julie. Good evening, everyone. Buenas noches. On behalf of York University's Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, I want to extend a warm welcome to you all for this We Walk the Earth premiere. This is the 3rd installment of the wonderful Grounded Project. The documentary we just viewed features Indigenous Bribri, Quebecar, Brunca, and Broran voices, sharing their struggles and objectives to secure land rights and autonomous governance in Costa Rica. It reflects Indigenous peoples' pain and persistence in rightly recovering their territories after more than 500 years of colonialism. Their struggle and their stewardship of Indigenous lands offer important insights on our relationship with the earth and how we might shape a more just and sustainable future. Notably, the teachings offered as part of this We Walk the Earth documentary are vital to our efforts to decolonize and carve a path of reconciliation. We are using this virtual space, this global classroom, to connect us all across many parts of the world. Engaging with the voices, the circumstances, and experiences of Indigenous peoples in Costa Rica is a rich entry point into all of us reflecting on the circumstances and experiences of Indigenous peoples in a global context. And as noted by Julie in her opening remarks, we are on a long, vital journey of truth in Canada with the goal of reconciliation with Indigenous communities who've experienced extensive trauma to their lands, bodies, identities, and histories. I want to offer my gratitude on behalf of the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University to those Indigenous peoples featured in and contributing to We Walk the Earth for these important teachings, And I offer gratitude to those who serve as allies to reconciliation in Costa Rica, in Canada, and beyond. I encourage all of us to take the opportunity and the responsibility to set us on a different path. Finally, I do want to note the importance of the arts, and notably today's medium of documentary films, in engaging our emotions and imaginations in ways that other mediums simply do not. This is especially important when we're wanting to unpack and articulate complex and unsettling issues such as those featured in We Walk the Earth. I am proud to be part of this faculty in this university and this community that espouses the importance of the arts as foundational in championing social, environmental justice, and sustainability. In closing, I would like to offer my gratitude to the esteemed panelists who are joining us for this portion of the event, and heartfelt congratulations to Felipe Montoya and Gilbert Gonzalez Morato for this provocative and compelling documentary film. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Hovorka. The Grounded Project was conceived as a way to overcome the challenges presented by the global pandemic, which prevented us from running our regular international programming. The central idea was to provide international experiential education through the Las Nubes program while maintaining the connections with our Costa Rican partners. Having just finished screening the premiere of We Walk the Earth, we are eager to hear from our 4 panelists and to hear their thoughts and your questions as well. So if you have questions, please post them into the chat box and we'll come back and try and consolidate them and hopefully answer as many questions as we can in the next 45 minutes. I have the privilege of introducing our panelists for this evening and helping to facilitate this conversation. So first of all, I'd like to introduce academic lead Gilbert in English, I always pause, Gilbert Gonzalez Morato, Executive Director for the Center for Indigenous Development, or CIDIN, as it's known in Costa Rica. Martha Stiegman, PhD from the Faculty of Environment and Urban Change at York University. Jose Miguel Gonzalez, a PhD and faculty in the liberal arts and professional studies at York University. And of course, our film director, Dr. Felipe Montoya from the Faculty of Environment and Urban Change to start this evening. So in the chat, we've posted, or we're posting the bios. So I encourage you to read and to learn about our esteemed panelists. But we'd like to get right to the conversation. So what I'd like to do is invite each of the panelists to react to the film with about a 5-minute commentary on your reaction to tonight's film. And we'd like to start off with Gilbert. Oh, I should also mention what will happen in this next portion because it's in Spanish and in English. Gilbert will speak. And then Dr. Felipe Montoya will ask if you would be able to translate for our English audience. Thank you. Gilbert.
Gilbert, es para usted empieza el panel con una reacción al documental y yo le traduzco lo que usted dice en inglés.
Sí, ¿qué tal? Muy buenas noches. Muy complacido de poder compartir esta hora de producción que fue bastante amplia, bastantes meses de trabajo continuo, junto con Felipe y otro equipo técnico, y que gente que colaboró mucho en la producción de este documental, pues que tiene como elemento central la tierra indígena.
Good evening and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and after this screening of this production that took many months to produce with a large group of people that all contributed to its production.
Sí, quizá uno de los...
and whose central theme is the land.
Sí, quizá uno de los elementos más importantes de este documental es que alrededor del tema central, que es la tierra, está, que es la voz primaria de las personas que han estado viviendo de manera continua en la última década todo este proceso de lucha por la recuperación de las tierras indígenas, ¿no?
The central theme being the land. The most important part of this documentary are the voices of those people who have been struggling to recover the rights to the land, especially during the last 10 years.
Son hombres y mujeres que han estado en la primera línea de lucha, ¿no? Son las personas que han estado sufriendo constantemente el acoso, la violencia y en este caso incluso el asesinato de compañeros y compañeras indígenas.
These are voices of men and women, indigenous men and women who have been in the front lines of this struggle, suffering the violence and including in some cases the assassination of their assassination.
Esa voz primaria significa que no tenemos interpretaciones externas del problema que ellos están abordando. No tenemos como otra infinidad de documentales, investigaciones que se han hecho, donde hay opiniones externas del problema que está sucediendo. En este caso son ellos, los hombres y mujeres, los jóvenes, quienes dicen cuál ha sido el proceso de lucha que han hecho, cuál ha sido el sufrimiento constante que han estado abordando, cuáles son sus sueños también, sus aspiraciones, ¿no? O sea, eso es muy importante porque cuando alguien interpreta lo que usted está pasando en el campo, tiende a tergiversarse o de una manera extremadamente positiva o extremadamente negativa. Y en este caso son ellos quienes dicen qué es exactamente lo que está pasando en el campo de lucha, ¿no?
In this documentary, the voices of the people are direct. It is they who are telling their stories. There's no narrator or outside voices that are interpreting their stories. They themselves are the ones that are telling what is happening on the ground. And this is very important because it's a way of them presenting what their situation is without having anyone else needing to interpret for them.
Si esta injerencia externa que podría haber existido en un documental de este tipo, podría generar una visión diferente, una visión negativa del proceso de lucha que están haciendo los indígenas, ¿no? Pero en este caso, cuando es la voz primaria de ellos, pues nos hace ver un proceso muy limpio, muy apegado a los derechos indígenas, ¿no? A la legislación existente, ¿no? Donde no se han violentado derechos de parte de los indígenas, ¿no? Sino que es todo lo contrario a la parte que ha estado en la invasión de los territorios indígenas, quienes han estado generando violencia, en este caso hasta los asesinatos que nos han comentado los compañeros y compañeras.
Once again, the possibility of telling their own stories is useful and propitious at this time when there is currently violence against the people who struggle for their land rights. The people who speak in this documentary are those who are in the front lines once again, and this is an opportunity to share this with the rest of the world.
Y tal vez el documental pudo haberse detenido en la lucha frontal entre indígenas y no indígenas por el derecho a la tierra, ¿no? Pero en este caso también se ahonda más en cuáles han sido los cambios que ha generado la recuperación de tierras. Ya Pablo Sieber nos ha dicho en la parte final cuáles son esos cambios positivos en la tierra, ¿no? Es una tierra que se ha vuelto productiva, donde han empezado a llegar los animalitos, donde hay una alta producción de autosuficiencia para los propios indígenas, ¿no? Y esos son temas que generalmente no se abordan o no se conocen, sino que simplemente todo se detiene en la lucha frontal entre indígenas y no indígenas, ¿no?
So yeah, to close, this documentary does not center its focus only on the violent struggle, but actually towards the end, it contributes with a vision of the recovery of the lands and the recovery of the biodiversity that occurs with the recuperation of these territories. So it's a more complete story that avoids just centering on the violent confrontation between indigenous people and their struggle for the land.
Algo también muy importante es que el proceso de recuperación de tierras, la mayoría han sido liderados por mujeres indígenas, bribris, teribes, bueno, aquí en mi tierra también en Boruca, han estado las mujeres liderando esos procesos. Eso tiene un significado sumamente importante que ojalá en un segundo documental podamos abordarlo más profundamente, ¿verdad? ¿Por qué la mujer es la que ha estado liderando estos procesos? Lo vemos en Chinaquichá con Doris Ríos, ¿no? Quien ha estado liderando en los últimos 5 años procesos intensos de recuperación de tierras, y este papel de la mujer es muy, muy importante.
Bueno, y Gilbert, voy a ir cerrando aquí, y voy a compartir con lo que has dicho. So, one final element that Gilbert is mentioning is the fact that women are the major protagonists in these land struggles. As we can see with Doris in Chinaquichá and Hailing and Yamilet in Salitre. This is an interesting element that Gilbert thinks that we could probably explore in another documentary. So,
sí, tal vez nada más agregar que quedan ahí pendientes, pues en este caso de diferentes cooperantes como la Universidad de George y otros que han estado involucrados, ¿no? Pues poder ahondar más en estos procesos desde una perspectiva externa, ¿no? Con mayor investigación científica, si se pudiese hacer otro documental desde otra perspectiva, mayor información también de lo que está sucediendo dentro de los territorios, que es algo en que se adolece en este momento. No hay información verídica que se emane desde los territorios indígenas, ¿no? Y una mayor incidencia política, ¿no? Por lo demás, me parece que es un documental muy bien logrado, ¿no? Y que refleja muy bien el sentir de los compañeros y compañeras indígenas.
So he invites York University to continue its work in this type of documentary, in other topics and other information that does not really is not really exposed beyond the indigenous territories. And to finish off, he thinks this is a documentary that fulfills its purpose. It's well done. It reflects the feeling of the people in the indigenous territories in southern Costa Rica. Gracias, Gilbert.
Gracias, Gilbert. Thank you so much. And thank you for allowing us the opportunity to share that space and have the conversation and bring it to light through this program. I'm going to actually now move on and ask if Martha Stiegman would be interested in sharing her reflections on the film.
Absolutely. Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Felipe and Gilbert, for such a powerful and inspiring film. And of course, to the Bribri and Boruca and other peoples featured in the film for your inspiring struggles and work and way of life that we can all take so much from. You know, my area of research straddles sort of food justice and food sovereignty movements, indigenous settler relations with a focus on treaty relations, and arts-based and participatory-based research methodologies. So I've done a lot of work in Mi'kmaq communities on the East Coast, documenting work that feels and looks very much like what was shared in this film. Indigenous communities reclaiming their you know, asserting their knowledge systems and their legal traditions, asserting treaty rights on their own terms, asserting jurisdiction, and also involved in the Talking Treaties Collective here in Toronto in Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat territory. doing work that's exploring what it means to be a treaty person here in Toronto and how we uphold the agreements that were made between the original peoples of this land and settler governments, agreements that are anchored in the knowledge systems and worldviews and legal and diplomatic traditions of Indigenous nations. So I don't speak as an Indigenous person, but as an allied scholar who's very much committed to the project of decolonization as it's playing out here in Canada. And I, this story and this film, I think, really resonates with our Canadian context and with, Indigenous resurgence and resistance here on Turtle Island and in so-called Canada, as well as the kind of settler colonial context and structural violence that we see in this country. So there's kind of a number of themes that I think really stand out to me in terms of the ways that I see this echoing North and South. I think the first is the relationship with land, with La Madre Tierra, with Mother Earth, that's articulated so clearly by the people that we meet in this film, who articulate, this sacred connection that they feel with the land that has spirit, that has agency, that's the basis of their identity, of their worldview, of their cosmovision, and of their culture, and the deep responsibility and conviction that they feel to defend her. And that's something that we very much see here in so-called Canada as well. We also hear them, speak of cultural resurgence, this new generation of Indigenous youth who are strong and proud of their culture. That's very much, we're in the middle of incredible cultural resurgence in Indigenous scholarship and in the arts and in community movements and in social movements. That's something that also resonates very much here in the Canadian context, as well as this very kind of absurd situation that one of our protagonists articulates about the need to advocate vis-a-vis a settler colonial state for proof that her land is hers, that she needs papers from the state to establish Indigenous title or Indigenous ownership or Indigenous relationships to land. That's a frustration that we hear Indigenous nations and leaders and people who have to interact with the land claims process and negotiations with the Canadian settler state articulating constantly. And so in response to this, of course, this movement of land reclamation and of defense of territory is something that we've seen a lot of here in Canada as well, often led, as Gilbert mentioned, by women, that we see in this film, by women, the role of women in these movements, from Wet'suwet'en territory, from Grassy Narrows, the Algonquins of Barrier Lake, the land reclamations in Six Nations, so the Haudenosaunee territory south of Toronto, in Mi'kmaq territory, resistance to fracking in Elsipogtog, and the Alton Gas Project along the Shubenacadie River. So many moments of Indigenous resistance, of blockades, of barricades, that is important to realize and to recognize that these are moments of asserting Indigenous law. They're moments of asserting jurisdiction. They're not just police actions as they're often portrayed in the media. And that often, we have the example in the film of Sergio Rojas, who pays the ultimate price, who's assassinated as part of this, and this outrageous act of violence, which of course echoes the killing of Dudley George, an Anishinaabe man who was shot by the Ontario Provincial Police 25 years ago in Ipperwash Provincial Park, right? So we don't have as many moments of perhaps this spectacular violence leading to death on Canadian barricades, but that kind of structural violence is deeply ingrained in the Canadian settler colonial context, in our culture and in our structures, right? We know that between 2017 and 2020, 25 Indigenous people were shot and killed by the RCMP, that Indigenous people were 10 times more likely to be killed than white people by police. We have the examples of, this happens during police incidents. We have the examples of Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Chantel Moore, Rodney Levi, who were killed by police during wellness checks, during mental health crises, right? Indigenous people are 4% of Canada's population, 30% of our male prison population are Indigenous, and 45% women. There's a race-based genocide of Indigenous people that the final inquiry on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report referred to as genocide that targets women and girls and Two-Spirit people. So the structural violence that we see in the film may play out differently in the Canadian context, but it's very alive and well here in Canada as well, which I think is important to point out. But finally, the kind of land reclamation that we see is very much an example of the kind of land redistribution, the vision for food sovereignty that La Via Campesina advocates for, the global movement for food sovereignty, the global peasant movement. It's a model of agriculture that the FAO tells us feeds 70 to 80% of people in the global south. It's a model of agriculture that we need to learn from, part of this movement of agroecology, if we're going to be able to adapt our food systems to the very real existential challenge of the climate crisis. So I think that there is just so much for us to take away from in this story and in this film, and from the Bribri and Gruka and other Indigenous peoples who are featured in it. So again, thank you, Felipe, and thank you, Hilbert, for sharing this story with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martha, for your reflections and insights. It's very helpful to contextualize parallels between what we saw in the film and what is happening in Ontario. I'd like to move on to Miguel Gonzalez, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Thank you very much. Good night, good evening, everyone, and thank you to the Grounded Project for inviting me to this conversation. Well-deserved congratulations to Felipe and his production team, Hilbert, Oscar, Douglas. Thank you very much. I did enjoy the film very much. Three things I would like to say as I begin my comment. I think the film is particularly welcomed because the Indigenous views and narratives are really, really well represented, and they're central and persuasive in the story. I find the film also is well thought thematically and chronologically, which is a wonderful representation of events in the last 10 years in Costa Rica. As we learned from the film as well, today Indigenous struggles for land are a matter of existential survival strategies, survival struggles, and also I think there are struggles for the rights to exist collectively and individually. I think the film also is powerful because it tells the various forms of dispossession, both historically and contemporary, of Indigenous peoples in southern Costa Rica. On the other hand, I believe that in perspective and in the context of Central America, this film is very much welcomed, a very much welcomed artistic creation to ongoing conversations in Costa Rica, but also in other countries in the region on the rights to self-determination of Indigenous peoples. One of the things that I believe is well done in the film is that the film conveys the various legal strategies for rights affirmation that are pursued by Indigenous peoples in Costa Rica to enforce recognized rights, but also to advance new ones as well. And I believe that the film is really powerful because it makes us think about the decisive transition to de facto strategies, as legal strategies have resulted long and at times ineffective. However, these de facto strategies have resulted in violence, as we learned. Like in one of the protagonists says or mentioned that Indigenous peoples have many enemies, and their lives are threatened. Their voices are silenced, And this resonates with other realities in Central America, where indigenous peoples have initiated similar or related land reclamation struggles. In other words, as they say, they live in their territories as prisoners. It's important to think about the type of anti-indigenous alliances or configurations emerging in Costa Rica and in other parts of the region, often involving elite groups, governmental authorities, corporations, individuals within the judiciary, and so on. I think we also learn about the violent crimes against indigenous peoples that remain in impunity. Although there seems to be a paucity in the violence waged by cattle ranchers, the usurper still threatens indigenous peoples, and these threats have not disappeared. So in a word, I believe the most wonderful part of the film, I believe, is the narration of land reclamation of ancestral territories. This is, I believe, is a core element of the film. Another important element of the film is that in the perspective of indigenous peoples, autonomy, sovereignty is not to be fought at the National Assembly or at the national institutional level, but to be pursued, needs to be pursued by the people in the territories. And this drives processes of land recovery. The other point I want to make, and I'm going to sort of finish my comment with this, is that we see here the multiple forms in which these processes of land reclamations are justified. One of the things that we learn is that the basis for this ancestral ownership, it's the question of alternative forms of land use, right? From cattle ranching versus subsistence economies, or for food security and sustainability, as mentioned by Marta. Also, it's justified based on alternative worldviews, from capitalist development and land exploitation for profit versus land as provider of life, as provider of alternative forms of development. In other words, I think it's more centrally, this is about an ethics of life that is not based on greed, but based on indigenous ways of life. And I'm going to finish with 4 points here. I believe that Felipe's films contributes to to counter the narrative of Costa Rica as nonviolent, as respectful of human rights, as inclusive and a peaceful country. I think that that is what Felipe and the protagonist contributes to challenge this narrative. And in other words, through the indigenous struggles and the indigenous voices, right? We learned that these struggles, these voices contest this narrative, as their social realities are more complicated, as the stories we watch and listen today, they're usually misrepresented or in the mainstream media or not covered at all. We also, I believe that the film reminds us that for indigenous peoples, the experience of land recuperation is worth it for multiple reasons, but particularly because they regain a sense of human dignity, a sense of life, and sort of a safety for their livelihood. I'm going to finish with that. Thank you very much, Felipe, and congratulations also, Gilbert. Felicidades.
Thank you, Miguel. Felipe, would you like to have your reflections in terms of what you've heard tonight, and also just your reflections on the process in making this film? I'd really like to hear from you.
Sure, I'll be brief to allow for questions from the audience. But I would like to first state how important the guidance and support of Gilbert was for producing this film. He provided the historical context and the continuity that Miguel talks about that he was pleased with. Gilbert allowed me to be able to put this in a chronological sequence that would also be coherent with the story. So that was, in terms of conceptual elements. That was vital support from Hilbert. Not only in conceptual terms, but in the field. It was through Hilbert that I was able to contact many of these people, people from the different groups, from the Bribri, from Cabécar, from the Broran, the Brunca, all of them with different cultures. Even though they're all indigenous, they have their own worldview, different views of the earth. They all do share a relationship with the land, and this is one of the things that I think is important, at least for me, to be able to express in this documentary, is that relationship, that important relationship with the land, and how it is it's contentious with a view of land as commodity. As Doris Rios mentioned, they don't look at capitalism, they look at well-being, and the relationship with the land, which Martha alluded to in terms of the crisis, environmental crisis, multifaceted environmental crisis we're facing today. People of the land are an alternative that emerges in this documentary, given the freedom to be stewards of the land. The land recovers, the land produces life, the land produces, as Pablo Sieber said, it produces happiness. So that's an alternative view of how to live a life on the earth and walk on the earth in a different way. The title, "We Walk the Earth," it tried to that emerges in the words of the different people sharing their stories, but I think it brings together not only the fact that indigenous people still walk the earth in Costa Rica, that they're present, despite the myth that Costa Rica is a non-indigenous country. They're present. We Walk the Earth also alludes to the struggles, as Don Enrique mentioned. He would walk at night for fear of being caught when they were struggling for land rights. And We Walk the Earth is a different way of relating to the earth. So I think that tried to bring together these concepts. I guess I would like to finish just by recognizing, even though it was right before the credits, but dedicating this film to Don Enrique, who was such an important voice in this documentary. His whole life was dedicated to struggle. He suffered the death of the assassination of his son for the struggle of the land, and he unfortunately wasn't able to watch this documentary in its complete form. His wife, Elides Digna Rivera, was able to watch it. We showed this film in the different communities that we took footage from, and they approved this final version. So I guess I'll just close with that.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you to all our panelists for your thoughts and reflections. I think for this next part, it's a bit of an open field for our viewers to ask questions, and you can place those in the chat. To get us started, though, I think each of you has talked a bit, and one of the central themes of the film is really the relationship between Indigenous communities and the state, which is quite complicated. And I wondered if, from your perspective, if you would be able to kind of comment a little further on how the Indigenous communities in Costa Rica, even with having claims to land and having legal protections, what is the state doing in terms of upholding or protecting Indigenous people there? And how might it be a little bit different or similar in Ontario? So that's our first question. And I don't know who would like to start us off with a response.
Maybe I can translate for Gilbert very quickly.
I think so.
Gilbert, la pregunta que pone Julie es, ¿qué es la relación de los indígenas con el Estado en Costa Rica? ¿Cuál es la situación actual y qué perspectivas hay? Si podrías comentar sobre eso. Estás en mute. No te oímos.
Ahora sí.
Sí.
Sí, la relación actualmente de los pueblos indígenas con el Estado es prácticamente nula. El actual gobierno creó una mesa técnica, ¿va?, para atender los problemas de tenencia de la tierra, pero más que todo atendiendo las necesidades de los no indígenas que son ocupantes ilegales de los territorios indígenas, ¿no? En campaña política, el presidente actual prometió solucionar los problemas, ¿no?, de tenencia de tierras, y por eso crearon la mesa técnica. En una primera gira que hicieron a los territorios indígenas del sur, lo que hicieron fue crear conflictos, más bien en cada uno de los territorios donde estuvieron presentes, ¿no? Entonces la relación prácticamente está fría, totalmente nula. No existe ninguna relación en el tema de tenencia de la tierra, ¿no? Y la única línea de negociación que existe o de conversa sobre el tema de la tierra es con el Instituto de Desarrollo Agrario, el INDER, que ha creado el Plan de Recuperación de Tierras Indígenas, ¿no?, y que, entre otras cosas, está una medición exacta de cada uno de los territorios, cuáles deben ser los procedimientos para las recuperaciones de tierras por parte de los poseedores ilegales, ¿no?, entre otros, ¿no? Pero es únicamente el mecanismo que existe, ¿va? No hay otra forma de relación, más allá de algo más que se ha creado por una directriz presidencial que se dio en la administración anterior, que es la de políticas públicas. Es decir, que cada ministerio, cada institución pública va a crear un mecanismo de diálogo, de relación, de negociación, de estructuración de proyectos en los territorios indígenas. Eso no ha avanzado mucho, solamente se ha creado en un territorio que es en Boruca, ¿no? Lo que sí está avanzando actualmente es el de acceso a la justicia con el Ministerio de Justicia, ¿va? Es un proceso que está muy avanzado, que es muy positivo porque hemos pasado de tener algunos protocolos a tener ya una legislación aprobada en la administración anterior que le dice al Ministerio de Justicia que tiene que crear esas líneas de diálogo, de conversación con los pueblos indígenas, y está en una etapa muy avanzada, ¿no?, donde ya hay protocolos para atender exclusivamente, por ejemplo, en la región sur, el Cantón de Buenos Aires. Sí, perdón.
Para traducir porque
claro, está muy largo.
Okay, so I'll try to summarize a bit of this. Basically, the relationship between the indigenous struggles and the state is on a 0.0. There's really no relationship at this point. There was with the previous administration. We have a new government that has been in office, I think 3 or 4 for half a year. The previous administration did have some directives for public policy to incorporate indigenous perspectives, especially with the Ministry of Justice, and that did advance with important elements, especially with the people in Boruca, the Brunca people in the Boruca indigenous territory. The current administration established a table of dialogue, but basically it's a dialogue between ranchers, non-indigenous ranchers that occupy indigenous territories illegally, and the indigenous people. And these conversations have actually ended up in violent confrontations. And so it's giving equal rights to the indigenous people that have legitimate land rights. They're sitting them at the table with those who have usurped this territory. And so most of them ranchers are using this platform to try to recover their rights. So at this point, the current administration is actually causing more problems than helping any.
Sí, en esa línea se han creado en el cantón acá en Buenos Aires un juzgado agrario exclusivamente para atender el tema de tierras indígenas, ¿no? Se ha avanzado también en lo que son los protocolos para la atención de problemas de familia, ¿no? El juzgado de familia también está atendiendo de manera exclusiva a las poblaciones indígenas, ¿no? Se ha avanzado también en otros protocolos, ¿no? Por ejemplo, también se ha avanzado en lo de peritajes culturales para que algunos delitos que se cometen en territorios indígenas sean atendidos con peritajes culturales y tengan un juzgamiento diferente al resto de la sociedad, ¿no?
Okay. Bueno, so yeah, as mentioned before, the Ministry of Justice is the one space that has advanced. There's the agricultural, what is it called? Agricultural office.
Yeah.
What is it? Yeah.
Tribunals.
Yeah, agricultural tribunal that deals with land conflicts. And so that has developed protocols for dealing with this. And also the cultural interpretation for cultural peritaje. How do you say that, Miguel?
Expert witness and cultural.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So for different crimes and this kind of thing, so that indigenous perspectives are interpreted correctly. So that's what there is for them.
Okay, we have two questions that I think this is playing into, and one of them is how many cases actually get resolved through those legal mechanisms that protect the land, and how many are being resolved through this territorial reclamation procedure that is taking place from the indigenous perspective. And there's also the question about why are steps not being taken to protect. So I'm going to combine those two questions and I'll put it back to you.
Otra pregunta, Gilbert, en cuanto a cantidad de tierras o recuperaciones que se hacen digamos, por la vía legal o administrativa versus recuperaciones de facto. ¿Cuál es el balance? ¿Cuál ha sido más efectivo? ¿Cuánto territorio se ha logrado en uno o el otro?
Bueno, en los últimos 10 años solamente se han recuperado 2 fincas por medios legales, que es de expropiación. 2 fincas, una en Boruca y otra en Terra, ¿no? Y por los medios de recuperaciones de hecho se han recuperado alrededor de unas 3.500 hectáreas aproximadamente entre Cavagra, Salitre, Ujarrás, Terra, Boruca y Reycurreva. Son 5 territorios más lo de Chinaquichaba, que no es tan extenso, pero es muy, digamos, impactante por el tema de la violencia que están ejerciendo los poseedores ilegales contra los recuperadores en Chinaquichaba. Son extensiones muy pequeñas, comparadas, por ejemplo, con Cavagro Salitre, donde tenemos recuperaciones de 200, 300 y hasta más hectáreas en un solo hecho.
Okay, so yeah, the difference between legal recovery and de facto recovery is tremendous. So in the last 10 years, the legal avenue has resolved the recovery of 2 farms, whereas de facto recovery, indigenous direct recovery of the territories has recovered over 3,500 hectares of land. So yeah, the difference is abysmal. And the second part of the question, y preguntan por qué el gobierno no hace nada para resolver estos temas.
Sí, es bastante temor a los conflictos, ¿no? Entonces le han dejado ese problema a los compañeros y compañeras indígenas, ¿no? El mecanismo es muy simple, ¿va? De recuperación de tierras, ¿no? La ley indígena especifica que es, en este caso, el Estado, a través de sus diferentes gobiernos, tienen que hacer ese tipo de recuperaciones de hecho. Significa que tiene que hacer notificar un desalojo al poseedor ilegal. Ese desalojo les da, creo que son 2 semanas para abandonar la tierra, ¿no? Una vez pasadas las 2 semanas, si no ha abandonado la tierra, tiene que ir con la policía y desalojarlos, como aplica en cualquier otra parte del país donde hay precarismo, ¿no? Ese es el mecanismo, ¿no? Eso no significa que el poseedor ilegal queda totalmente indefenso, ¿no? Ellos tienen derecho a ir a los juzgados agrarios, a los diferentes juzgados que existen en el país y reclamar sus derechos, ¿no? Si son poseedores y tienen derechos, pues el juzgado en su momento se los dará, ¿no? Pero ese es un proceso que tiene que hacerlo el gobierno, no los pueblos indígenas. Y en este caso, pues, incluso hay una anécdota bastante irrisoria de la administración anterior, ¿no? Que se hicieron 2 recuperaciones en Salitre, 2 fincas, y posteriormente llegó el Estado con periodistas, con policías, a hacer el acto oficial de entrega a la Asociación de Desarrollo, ¿va? Cuando ellos no habían hecho absolutamente nada, ¿va? Quienes habían puesto el pecho a las balas eran los indígenas.
Bueno, so the reason why the state doesn't do anything to fix the situation or to attend the indigenous demands is that they're afraid. Hilbert says that they are afraid of violent repercussions. And the fact that the state has to go in and I guess kick out the illegal owners will result in violent struggles. And so they just they shove this off onto the indigenous people to deal with it themselves. So it's just a way of passing the buck. I think I missed. Oh yeah. So Hilbert mentions a ridiculous example in the last administration, where there was actual de facto recovery of some indigenous territories, and then the government came in as claiming that they had moved the indigenous struggle forward with these 2 farms, when in fact the government had not done anything, but they came to claim that as one of their achievements.
I'm aware that their time is ticking, and this is so interesting. We're getting more and more questions, so I'm going to move forward and try and ask at least 2 more in the next 4 minutes. Let's see if we can do this. One of the questions that's come up is, where are the allies to the indigenous people in this? I mean, right now it sounds and it feels like the indigenous people are on their own with this, and there's autonomy in that, but there also needs to be allyship. So I'm just wondering, where are the allies for the indigenous communities in this story? And how might people be an ally to this overall issue of territory and land struggles and autonomy? I'm actually going to maybe ask if Miguel and Martha would be able to address this from your experience, and we'll come back for the last question to Hilbert.
Martha, do you want to go first?
So what kind of role do allies play in this kind of movement? Is that the question?
Correct. Whether it's in Costa Rica or in Ontario and Canada, throughout the Latin America, from your experience, where are the allies and how do people do that? And I think there may be some viewers who are really interested and passionate about this, but feeling on the outside of having just watched and witnessed.
Well, I mean, I certainly can't speak to the Costa Rican context, so I'll leave Gilbert to talk about that. But, in the Canadian context, we do see a lot of allyship with Indigenous-led movements. I think our first role, as when thinking about what our roles are as allies or as aspiring allies, is really sort of doing our homework, learning about the history of and the Indigenous peoples whose lands we're on, understanding the protocols, understanding the governance traditions in places where treaties have been negotiated, agreements that host nations intended to guide relationships with the Crown and relationships with settlers. We have a responsibility to learn about the original spirit and intent of those agreements, and learn about the ways that our structural sort of capitalist and settler colonial country works against them, and to find material ways to support Indigenous struggles in the lands that we're on. It goes beyond just raising awareness and standing. There are basically with sweat equity or financial resources in order to really support communities that are very much on the front lines.
On that, or even some final thoughts before we move on.
Sorry, Julie, do you want me to speak to the question briefly?
Yeah, if you could do that,
Yeah,
that would be great.
just in 1 minute. I will defer to Felipe and Gilbert to speak about allies in the context of Costa Rica. But in general, I would say that in the region, in Central America, I would say key allies to Indigenous peoples are certainly human rights organizations, land defenders who are linked to civil society organizations working closely with Indigenous peoples, and sometimes these organizations are supported by other international organizations. There are many, and in particular, I would say within the Inter-American Human Rights System, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is an OAS organization based in sort of an Inter-American mechanisms that promotes, encourages, develops normative standards regarding human rights. The results are there, that space, and more recently, that instance have developed a report on the rights of self-determination. So we, in the context of a project that I have coordinated this year, and with the support of Felipe and York University Las Nubes campus in Costa Rica, we did organize an event with the commission in attendance and with Indigenous peoples of the region. And so it was clear to me that within that context, there are important allies, and that they've been able to work on important fronts, particularly on issues regarding land and rights. Yeah.
Thank you. I have the dubious responsibility of tying this conversation to a close. But before we do that, I wanted to ask if Gilbert and Felipe would like to provide some final remarks before we close out this evening's session. And I apologize we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but we have taken note of them, and maybe we will post it online in response. So do you want to ask?
I'll just say a few words very quickly in terms of who the allies are in Costa Rica, and then I'll ask Gilbert his opinion as well. But the universities have worked closely with Indigenous struggles and with the peritaje. Once again, Miguel, that's what's the term in English?
Expert witness.
Yeah, expert witness for Indigenous cases, and in different struggles there are different allies. For example, the struggle against the Boruca hydroelectric dam environmentalist NGOs came together with indigenous communities. And so it also is contextual. The different struggles may bring on different allies. Campesinos, people of the land, have certain struggles. The La Villa Campesina, which is this global organization of peasants and indigenous people, sometimes they come together in common battles. In other times, the non-indigenous campesinos and the indigenous people are at odds. So really, it's contextual. But I'll ask Gilbert who he thinks are the allies at this point. Gilbert, una pregunta en cuanto a los indígenas en Costa Rica, como para ya cerrar, ¿quiénes son los aliados, digamos, en sus luchas y qué pueden hacer y qué hacen los aliados como para apoyar?
Sí, hay varios aliados importantes. Uno es el sistema universitario público, pero el aporte que están haciendo, que es importante, sustancial, se limita mucho a la investigación y a mostrar mucho de lo que está sucediendo en los territorios indígenas, pero más allá de eso no puede generar grandes cambios, ¿no? Hay algunas organizaciones también civiles que están trabajando de manera cooperativa con las comunidades indígenas, ¿no? Y eso también es muy positivo, la parte económica que hace falta, ¿no? Y hay un elemento que sí nos está atendiendo de manera eficiente, ¿no? Y que tiene que ir aparejado con lo que es el juzgado agrario. En este momento, el tema legal para las comunidades indígenas, para las organizaciones, asociaciones de desarrollo, los liderazgos, no existe ninguna unidad técnica de tipo legal para poder coadyuvar las luchas que están dando dentro de los territorios indígenas, ¿no? Eso es una debilidad que tenemos en este momento y que podría ser un tema que podemos abordar en conjunto con la Universidad de York para escalar diversas formas cooperativas con diferentes organizaciones en la parte técnica y financiera, ¿no? Pero es básicamente la solidaridad que tenemos. Aparte de eso, pues muchas otras personas que cooperan, que colaboran y que están anuentes a poder mostrar lo que está pasando en las comunidades indígenas y que es un elemento importante para que el resto de la sociedad costarricense se sensibilice de lo que realmente está pasando. Porque los medios de comunicación, la inmensa mayoría, está mostrando una realidad que no es la que está sucediendo entre los territorios indígenas, ¿no? Los medios de comunicación masivos están vendiendo una información que no es la que se ajusta a la realidad, ¿no? Y los medios de comunicación de carácter social pues son mínimos y no tienen el impacto que tiene el resto de medios de comunicación.
Muy
es
bien.
otra debilidad que podríamos trabajar en eso, a que lo que es la comunicación desde los territorios indígenas hacia lo externo para que la gente conozca con mayor amplitud lo que está pasando.
Okay. Voy a cerrar con eso. Gracias, Gilbert. So yeah, the public university system are allies, especially in the area of research and knowledge mobilization, which is something that has limited a limited impact. It's important, but it doesn't end up in changes in policy, for example, not necessarily or directly or immediately. But the solidarity of the people, of different people, is important for indigenous struggles in terms of allowing their stories to be told, as the case of York University has done with this documentary. And this is very important, especially to counter the biases of mass communication, the mass media that does not tell their stories from the indigenous point of view. So this is how I can end this part.
And are there any last final reflection? Thank you for answering the questions. Are there any last final reflections that you have before we close the evening? From any of our panelists? There's a lot to be said, so it's really a tough ask here.
I'll quickly reflect on one very particular thing, and that is that in the 3 documentaries that we've done so far, there's a common element of people and their relationship to the land. So what I would like to emphasize here is the importance of people of the land, migrants, peasants, indigenous people have a very important message to share to the rest of the world that that are not directly related to the land, but ultimately depend on the land. So a different relationship with the land is something that we should pay attention to in this story and other stories that we've seen before.
And I would add that, you know, that lesson that lesson such an importance on take note of if we're going to be able to address the climate crisis. But, you know, with that lesson comes a responsibility to reciprocate and to find ways to support the struggles, the real urgent struggles of Indigenous people on the land as well.
Thank you. Well, it's unfortunate, but it is the time where we come to our close. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone this evening for their time and interest in this really important issue and topics and all of the themes that were covered in it. Thank you to our guest panelists, Gilbert Gonzalez, Martha Stiegman, Jose Miguel Gonzalez, and Felipe Montoya. And thank you to our program partners and the communities where we worked for this project, for the University Técnico Nacional in Costa Rica for their support with some of the translations, for the York University Libraries, York International, the Faculty of Health, Faculty of Environment and Urban Studies, who worked so hard to bring the event to life. And finally, we thank you, all of our guests this evening, for your attention, and we wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you, everyone. Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for the people behind the screens, Ana Maria Martinez and Matthew Poirier, that are working the chats and work the technical aspects. So thank you very much as well. And thank you, Julie, for emceeing.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Martha.